Hello and welcome to the Wise Why. This morning I am joined by Aziz Musa. I hope I got that correct. Absolutely brilliant guy. And you know what? I'm not even going to mention anything about me, so I'm going to go straight over to Aziz. Over to you because you and your life story and your journey and your pivots are truly awesome.
Oh, thank you, Kirsty. So, well, actually, but I guess I'm the guest, so I'll talk this time. But thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be here. We've had quite a few conversations actually. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I think I was in Dubai when we first discussed doing this. So, yeah, my life story I hope isn't at the end yet. I'm hoping I'm only halfway through it, but so far it's been quite interesting. So I was brought up in Blackpool in Lancashire. My family originally Sudanese, and my background is business. That's what I studied, and it just so happened that the businesses that were blooming when I graduated were all digital businesses. So I joined very early in lastminute.com. I'm not sure, is lastminute.com still a thing in the UK?
Oh, that's a really good question. It certainly was. I wouldn't know without actually doing an internet check right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely was lastminute.com. I think I've even booked through them.
Oh yeah, most people have. I
Yeah.
mean, it was such an icon of like the British tech scene for so long, and I was really fortunate to be early on in lastminute.com, and then I worked in Dubai for a bit. Then I worked for moonpig.com and Photobox and companies like this, and then I became the CEO of a public company in the UK. I was the youngest public company CEO at the time. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but anyway, I was at that time. And after that, I kind of felt like I wasn't doing anything of value in the world. And I think that was probably the biggest epiphany moment for me. Was I really felt like I wasn't doing anything of value, and so I decided. I mean, look, it was high risk, but we did it anyway. Me and my wife decided, well, let's just go to Sudan and start a social enterprise. We're financially comfortable. Let's just do that. Well, okay, so we did that. Excuse me. For those of your audience who don't know much about Sudan, it was under sanctions for 30 years. So digital just didn't exist. There was no Facebook ads, no Google ads, nothing. So we arrived in 2017, built this social enterprise designed purely to train the next generation in digital skills. And just through happenstance, we ended up becoming the largest digital marketing agency in the region and the fastest growing in the Middle East as well. And that really wasn't my objective. I was just using that to train people. And then, as many of your audience will know, there was a war in Sudan in April of last year. And so we migrated the whole team into Egypt. And that's where we are now. We're based actually registered and operate out of the UAE. We have sort of a team here in Egypt and a team in the UAE as well. That's the short version.
You've got a bit of...
It's 43 years.
Yeah, you've got a bit of... And I'm just going to mention, you've got a bit of feedback. Now, we're using StreamYard, so if you look at the bottom, there is a settings button. And if you click in there, if anyone doesn't know how to use StreamYard, you're going to learn. If you click in there, you should have a noise reduction and just check it. But you're just to give you a heads up that you've got a bit of feedback going on. So back to that pivotal moment. Yeah, moving out of where you were and launching a social enterprise, it doesn't just happen. Suddenly wanting to give something back in the world. It's truly inspiring. And your wife came with you. So I'm just wondering if you can just talk a little bit or expand a bit about that moment where you just went, I want to help people.
I think it was probably a little bit more organic than that. I think the initial thought was, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not adding any value. I'm not doing anything. And what I was doing was I was, like I said, I was a CEO of a public company, which essentially means I spend most of my time with investors, institutions, and chasing a number, a share price. And this number is, it's managed by so many different variables. I felt entirely out of control. And I just felt like I was working relentlessly and doing nothing of value. I think that's where it came from, like that dissatisfaction with where I was. Then sort of evolved into, well, what would be of value? And then it evolved into, well, in Sudan, they don't have any sort of digital infrastructure. Why don't we try and help build that? And that's kind of how it kind of came from that dissatisfaction first.
It must have been incredible to find yourself in Sudan. You've come from Blackpool, you've been in a really quite a pressured job, and now you're in a place that's completely different. That must have just blown your mind.
Yeah, I think if anyone's been to Blackpool, it's probably not too different to a third world country. But sorry, apologies, Lancashire people. It was, I'll be honest, it was fantastic. It was an entirely different experience. I expected it to be really, really difficult for me, my wife, and the kids. I think the good thing was that there were good schools. That helps immediately when you've got good schools available. But also, my mum moved to the UK in the early 70s. And as I was growing up, she used to say to me, the only difference between Sudan and UK life is that in Sudan, the women wear headscarves. And I never really understood that. But what she meant is that the communities were so tight-knit in Lancashire. Everybody knew everybody. Everyone was there for everyone. Everyone helped each other out. And somehow, over the years in the UK, well, certainly where I was living in the UK, that kind of disappeared. People don't really engage with each other. And that isn't the case in Sudan. Everyone really engages with everyone.
Community is so important, especially if you're a business owner. It's something that I really care about. I'm really lucky. I have an amazing community and people I can reach out to, as I have this morning with the DMARC thing. And I don't know if I could live in a place where you didn't walk down the street and say hello. And I did for a while. I'm sorry, London, I'm going to call you out. But, London, you're there, you're storming, ding, 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 you're in your own little world. And then you lock your door and you shut it. And, coming out to the suburbs and the rural countryside, and I get that community. But was it a huge difference when you got to Sudan, or was it? I'm just intrigued.
It was, of course, it was a huge difference because the infrastructure wasn't there in Sudan. Electricity cut for like 6 and 7 hours a day. The internet was flaky. Water would cut. The roads aren't developed. There's lots of really massive, massive differences. So all of these things that we just take for granted in the UK or in Dubai, when I go to Dubai, they just don't exist, or they exist at a really weak level. So yeah, it was a dramatic shift in terms of lifestyle, but it was massively overcompensated for in terms of community and sort of feeling belonging and part of it, something greater. And of course, the work that I was doing there was it wasn't charity. I don't believe I never I never think that what we were doing was charity. It was much more around sort of building capabilities with a commercial end for the individuals and then ultimately for us. So it wasn't charity, but I think it had the same psychological impact. It felt great. It still does feel great. That's why I don't think I'd ever go back to working, a normal job. I just feel like what we do is really good. It's really good for me, and it's really good for the people that we work with. And so why would we just keep doing it?
So I want to talk about that, because you just mentioned we kind of skipped over it, but you were in Sudan when a war broke out, and you got your staff and you protected everybody. And I think this is incredible. When we spoke a couple of months ago, I was just absolutely blown away by this. So I wondered if you, because it must. What was it like?
It was awful. It was, however bad you think war is, it's 100 times worse. Because it wasn't in a distant place. Like, it was right in front of our office and our house. It was like right there. You can see and you can feel the vibrations of the anti-aircraft fire. And it was everything was cut, so we didn't really know anything. So you have to make really tough, really quick decisions, literally life and death decisions. And look, thankfully we had a plan in case something like this ever happened, and we sort of executed that plan really quickly. I mean, it was harrowing, honestly, because there were things that I have seen and smelled, Kirsty, that I don't wish on anybody. I would never wish on anybody. And when I look at like Twitter and TikTok at the moment, and you see all these like Twitter warriors exclaiming so proudly, "Oh, we should just exterminate them, and they should bomb here," and you just think, you have never seen war. If you have ever seen war for 5 seconds, you would never ever wish that on anybody. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that I took away from it. Yeah, like I was in Sudan with a responsibility, and it would have been wrong for me to just leave that responsibility and go. And I remember speaking to the British Embassy at the time, and they said, "Look, we've got evacuation flights coming up. Just hang tight, and we're going to evacuate you on those evacuation flights." And sitting down with my wife and my kids and thinking, okay, well, we could get on one of these evacuation flights back to the UK. But then what about the 70 people that, we've just spent the last 6 years developing? And so we made the decision, and we had the plan. We knew what we were going to do, and we kind of, everything went according to that plan. But it was really, really, really tough.
I'm just blown away, because when you told me that story, I've got goosebumps as I'm sitting here, because, human beings are innately selfish, but you're not. Here you were, not just looking at your family, but looking at your wider community. As you said right back at the very beginning, that community is really important to you. And now you've taken the community with you, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think humans are innately selfish until the point that they experience that in the extreme, then they realize that that is a futile path. And I, in my past, have experienced that in the extreme, So I lived that sort of that lifestyle, and thought I enjoyed it for a period of time, and then realized that actually it was just, for me personally, I'm not saying it is for everybody, but for me personally, it was incredibly destructive. And so I having been through that, I felt like actually there are just more important things in life. And so I think you kind of have to go through that. It's hard to say that being selfish is bad, especially as, Kirsty, especially as a capitalist, because I am a capitalist ultimately. I do believe in capitalism. So it's difficult to say that selfishness is bad, because I don't think it is, but that it has to be in the context of a wider community, I think.
And I think that's a great one, because as a mom, one of the things that mums, and I'm going to go that selfish word, it's an interesting one, because my daughter, she's 7, she uses it all the time about someone at school is really selfish. They won't share their sweets on the really simple level. But actually, sometimes we get selfish mixed up. As a mom, buying a moisturizer or going and buying something for me feels incredibly selfish, which is ridiculous. I was talking to a mum yesterday, and I actually said to her, what was the last thing you did for yourself? And she was like, "Whoa, what do you mean?" I was like, well, so sometimes I think selfishness is actually really important, because there's that thing, isn't it? You don't put your child's life, if the plane's going down, you put your oxygen on first, and then you go to the child, because actually you've got to make sure that you're able to cope. So there is an element, I think, of selfishness that you need to keep, isn't there?
Yeah, I think you're right. But that story that you just said, about buying moisturizer, it reminds me, my wife goes on at me about this all the time, because whenever I'm in Dubai, like a few months ago, I was in Dubai, and I went to buy myself some new aftershave. And I went and I kind of tried a few, like you do, and I said, "Oh, I like that one." So I took that aftershave, and I was like, "Yeah, that's nice." And the lady went to ring me up, and I said, "No, now I want 7 more of them." She goes, "What? 7? Why would you want 7 more?" It's like, "Oh yeah, I can't buy it just for myself. I want to give one to my father-in-law, to my brother-in-laws, to my neighbor." Do you know what I mean? So it's like kind of ingrained in me a little bit that, if you do something for yourself, you have to do it for other people. And
Yeah.
I can certainly see that with my wife. My wife would, she'd go without clothes on her back just to make sure that the kids were fully fed and clothed and had everything they needed. And I think that's definitely a biological thing, right?
Yeah, no, and to be fair, my husband's just bought me a standing desk. It's currently in a box, and so as of next week, I will be standing. But that's because he's bought one for himself.
Is he sharing the
I
love
love
there, or
you.
is he sharing the pain?
I love you, Dennis. I do. I am genuinely excited. I'm looking forward. I don't think the audience will be when I'm dancing around. So you're now in Egypt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in Aswan in Egypt, which is like in the south part of Egypt. Most people who went through primary school will have learned about the Aswan Dam. don't know why they taught us about that in primary school, but they did. They definitely taught us it was part of the curriculum.
So what is it that you, because we've talked about the social enterprise, we've talked about you launching this digital marketing, and I'm just wondering if we can go and explain a little bit about how you empower others to do.
Sure. So essentially what we are is we're a digital marketing agency. That's all we do. So it's called Kush Digital. That's Kush.digital. And our model is unique in that we deliberately hire people or bring people into the company who have no digital experience. And what we do is we put them through this 6 months of like intensive training. And through that 6 months, they get to learn a variety of skills. And then the good ones who are like really excelling, we put them into the company and they start working with clients. So that's kind of what we do as an agency.
I think it's brilliant. I really do. You know, it's what a lot of people dream. Oh, it's what I dream of. You know, I'll get some people and I'll train them up, and then I'll be able to put them in. That's how I want to scale. So I'm sitting here going, I'm very jealous right now. So you know, I'm hands off. So who's inspired you? You talked about your wife. You've talked about your children. You talked about the community. But is there any point where someone has really made you just go, oh, that's interesting?
My dad, like throughout all of my life. You know, my dad was a doctor in the NHS for 35 years. He had an incredible work ethic, and he kind of taught us through lessons through life. You know, I reference my dad in every training that I do. You know, whenever we're talking about firstly, the importance of not believing the environment that you're in, right? Especially in Sudan, you've got 40 million people who believe they're in the worst possible environment. There's no way out. Well, okay, look at my dad. My dad was born in a tiny village in the north of Sudan without electricity or running water, and he went to a prestigious university and became a doctor in the NHS, having been a doctor in other places in the world too. He built a lifestyle that people would be envious of. He had 6 children with my mum, and he did that without any handouts, without any rich parents to support him. He did it himself. My dad's my hero. I mean, he taught me kind of everything that I know.
That's just incredible. And so you grew up, did you grow up in the 70s in Blackpool?
Yeah, in the 80s. So I'm an 80s child.
All right, yeah, I'm that lot older. That must have been really strange as well. It can't have been particularly easy. So when did your parents move over from Sudan?
So my mum and dad moved over from Sudan in the early 70s. And so I know my elder brothers had to deal with a lot in Lancashire, right, in terms of racism and all of that. But by the time I got to school, there were three, get mixed up myself sometimes. So I got 3 elder brothers, and they had all been through school, and I went through the same schools, and I didn't really experience any of the issues that they had experienced. They told me about the things that happened, but by the time because we were the first non-white family in our village, but by the time I got to school, we were the Musas.
Right, yeah. And I see that, funnily enough, when I moved out to where I live now, I remember turning around to Dennis, and went, he's European, so he's from Holland, and there was a bit of kickback around the Brexit towards him, but not much. But one of the things I remember saying to him, because I'd come from school in London, was, "It's a little bit white out here." And he was like, "Really?" I went, "Yeah." And the reason I chose the school my daughter goes to was I didn't want her to grow up as white privileged, not understanding what other people go through, because as a white person, I think it's my responsibility to educate my very white daughter that she has to be open to be aware of what our predisposed judgments, which we are all guilty of, whether we I remember saying I don't see color. That's probably the most ridiculous thing I could ever say. And so I've now made myself see it, if that makes sense. Probably doesn't. But
yeah, it does. It makes total sense.
I was looking at my website yesterday, and I was putting some more information on it, and I was making sure that I was proportionally representative. Anyway, it's just something that I'm really aware of, because I grew up, and when I came out here, it was so white, which was a bit of a shock.
Yeah, I can
You're gonna say
imagine. I think that we have a similar thing with our kids. I think that race and color is kind of one element of it, and sometimes maybe we get focused on you know, how we feel or how we interact with people. But actually, I think at a fundamental level, it's about learning about other cultures and humanity, learning how other people are raised and what environments they've been in. And I think that there's just a massive advantage to that. You know, my dad was really fastidious about making sure that we traveled. So when we were young, he would travel with us, but then when, you know, we went to take our gap year, we had to travel. It wasn't like, you know, there's no option here. You got to travel. So, you know, 18 years old, traveling around India by yourself, you learn a lot really quick. And I think that is something that that has really benefited me. And I try to make sure that the environment that my kids are in, like the school that they go to, is a multicultural school. Even in Aswan in Egypt, it's not just Egyptians. There's Americans, there's British, there's Sudanese, there's lots of different nationalities there. And just by being in that environment, I think they kind of learn a lot through osmosis, if that makes sense. And that, yeah, that kind of keeps their mind open to the fact that they're just a small part of a much wider world, right?
so. What's the biggest learning, or the biggest? I quite like this one actually. The biggest learnings. I always think that I've made lots of mistakes, and I'm really open about my mistakes, and I call them magical mistakes because that comes from my daughter's teacher, Mrs. Harris, last year, who she was getting in a real strop over some artwork, and she'd made a mistake, and Mrs. Harris turned around and said, "No, it's a magical mistake," and since then it's stuck. And so thank you, Stephanie. But is there anything that has been a biggest learning or a mistake that you've turned into a real positive that has completely changed the way you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think lots. Firstly, I've made lots and lots of mistakes because I'm a human being, and we all make lots of mistakes. I think I've made some absolute monsters though as well, which has been impressive. I think probably the biggest mistake that I learned that I've learned from was, again, whilst I was the CEO of a public company, I had become so lost in myself and what work was, or what I thought work was, and success and what I thought success was, that I just entirely neglected my family. And I think for a period of like 18 months, I was just totally absent, entirely absent, if not physically absent, emotionally and mentally absent. And that put a massive strain, obviously, on my relationship with my wife and with my kids as well. And even now, just thinking about that, that period of time was so awful. But it wasn't awful because it felt awful. It was awful because I didn't recognize how awful I was at that time. But it's only in hindsight that I get to look back and go, oh my God, I was just in a different universe. And my entire life pivoted after that moment. Up until that time, I had been a quite aggressive career person. And after that time, career is fourth or fifth in my list of priorities.
Absolutely love that, because I think that's why I'm sitting here now. I could have gone into that road. Could have driven to the next level. I would have probably burnt out, but I could have driven. And then it was like, actually, no, no, there is even trying not to work the weekends so I can spend time with my daughter and time with my husband. Because when I launched this, I had my head down, and I can become hyper focused and then don't talk to me because I'm in my zone and I don't want to talk to anyone until I've finished my task. That's not healthy. So I'm really pleased and I'm really grateful you shared that. We've had a couple of comments. We've had Joanne join us, and she said, I went to a secondary school which was 50% white and 50% black, Asian, etc. Coming from a very white village and schools, this was probably a great move from a young age. I always see the person first. Yeah. Color, backgrounds, etc. is of no consequence. I do not understand any other concept. And I think that's what, well, it's certainly what I try to do. I don't know if you've got anything on that. You've just gone to
Yeah,
mute.
I tend to switch between mute so you don't get my background. But yeah, I completely agree with that comment. I think that what's interesting is that when I was growing up, that option that she's describing there didn't exist, right? So white kids were growing up in entirely white communities and neighborhoods. They didn't have an option. So a lot of what people perceived at the time as racism wasn't racism. It was a lack of understanding of the thing that you don't understand, or a fear of the unknown. And as they grew up, you know, some of the kids who were mean to me when I was young became my best friends later on, because that wasn't in their nature to be mean. They just didn't know what they were dealing with. And so I think that there's a great sort of opportunity that exists like that in the UK. But I will say that doesn't exist everywhere. Where in Sudan, for example, most children go to entirely Sudanese schools, and it creates a racism that you couldn't necessarily comprehend. If you, Kirsty, were to be walking down the streets in parts of Sudan, you would experience racism purely because they've never seen a white person before. Not necessarily in the capital, but in certain villages and in the north. So, yeah, I think it's that exposure that's really beneficial. Like I said, it's like you get other people's life experiences and cultures via osmosis. And so I think that's really helpful.
That was really interesting what you just said there, because Dennis and I like to travel. And before our daughter came along, we definitely did travel. And not naivety so much, but just because we wanted to see the world from our eyes without having to necessarily do it with a guide. We ended up in 2 countries where we kind of ended up, and we were walking, particularly in one country, we were walking around the major city, and we were swooped on by one of the local officials, who then said, "You cannot walk here. You cannot do this. You are white. You cannot walk here without a guide. Where is your guide?" And we were like, well, we wanted to explore and just feel. And it was a real learning curve. I will be honest. We got to see an amazing culture, because he took us to some really cool places, and we got to see the heart of the city. But we had no idea that what we were doing wasn't acceptable. And I think that was and it was the word acceptable is what he said. He said, what you're doing is not acceptable. And it was a really interesting learning curve. We didn't learn particularly from that one, because we then did it again and then had to route around to find a guide in another country. But we have now learned we can't be quite so gung-ho. But yeah, being aware of culture is something, and of course I didn't have my daughter at this point, but being aware of culture is and understanding is something that I learned on those 2 holidays, and I carry them forward with me now and hold them dear, and I still get it wrong, and I will continue to get it wrong, but I'm big enough and old enough to be able to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. So
yeah, that's awesome.
you.
That's great.
Thank you. So this is where the tables get to turn, and I get to put my head down and worry a little bit that you're going to ask me a question that I may not be able to answer. So the floor is yours.
I have so many questions, and you did tell me that I was going to get time to ask questions. So obviously I've been marinating on a few, because I think there's a lot of similarities in the way that you approach life and the way I approach life. One of the small things that you mentioned to me, I don't know if you make this public, but you only work during term time, which I think is fantastic. Like, that's really, really valuable. But I did notice that you'd launched a bunch of courses. I want to know 2 things, if it's okay. So 1 question, 2 parts. Why do you love teaching? Because I've got to assume you love teaching, because as someone who's done courses in the past, that's not an easy endeavor. And what do you think people get from your courses versus other courses that they could take?
Oh, good question. So why do I like teaching? I like helping. One of the biggest things when I launched, KVDB was I knew an awful lot, but there was a lot of gaps in my information. And to get the information, or to more of the case, to reaffirm that what I knew, it cost me a lot of money. And so I got quite frustrated. And as a small business owner, you don't have a lot of money, not when you're first starting out, and you're trying to run your business as light as humanly possible. So I wanted to create something that would empower others to be able to do it for less than 100 quid. So I created 3 courses, which was, one is camera confidence, one is the understanding the principles of social selling, and the most important one is actually the one that people don't realize is important, and that's called identifying your key messages. Because if you don't know what you do and you don't know how you help, then you don't know how you serve, and if you don't know how you serve, then you can't bloody sell. Oh, I just swore. So I created something because one of the other things is people go on and on and on about SEO, 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 SEO. You need SEO, you need to get it in, but nobody actually explains what search engine optimization is. And so you end up in this myriad of hell trying to, a bit like the DMARC and trying to link my Outlook and all the other bits. You're in a world that you don't understand and you get overwhelmed. So I realized about 2 years ago that there was a symbiosis between your key messages and your SEO. And it's actually a lot simpler than people think. Now, I used it by using some very lovely free software. I'm going to name them. Thank you, Google, with your ranking coach. And thank you for Ranking Math. So thank you. And I taught myself it. So now I created the courses to help other people be able to kickstart their business for 100 quid. That's the difference. Is I'm going to give you 3 courses. You can buy them separately because I know that not everyone can afford £97. I know I'm really charging a fortune here. So I started it with the social selling at 27. The identifying your key messages is 37. And of course, my signature course, camera competence, is 47. So you can, if you want to, buy them separately. I did it deliberately to help others because I couldn't find anything like it. And that's why I did it. So does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And you're so right. The number of people that over the years that I've spoken to who want to start their own business or have even started and been sort of going through loops for sometimes years without really getting, particularly, understanding what your core message is and why that's so important, and not really understanding that. Look, I think that's a lot of great value that you deliver, and having known you, I know that people will get a lot from that experience.
So Joanne's just said, I'm going to love Joanne. She's just said, identifying key messages course was brilliant and a proper eye-opener. Love you.
Oh.
Can I steal that from my course? You can get better than that. I'd like to finish back to you because I think it's important. So, because this show is not about me, and I thank you for letting me highlight what I do. But what's next for you?
More of the same, I hope. More of the same. I'm really loving what I do. Like I said, we've got a digital marketing agency. We're always looking for new clients. So if anyone wants to have a digital marketing agency, we don't cost a fortune. We just do great work. And I love doing what we do. I'm really happy doing what we do. I think probably what's the next big thing on the horizon is that my eldest daughter is going to be going to university in the next 18 months. So I'm kind of like, that's probably top of mind at the minute, but maybe a bit more of this. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Kirsty, and recently I've done quite a few podcasts, and this is one of the more enjoyable ones because it's kind of, firstly, your English, which shouldn't make a difference, but it does make a difference, and secondly, it's so conversational and just lovely to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving your time this morning. I really enjoyed it. Lots of thoughts in there.